Often when we have these discussions around equity, we're centering as if this is only going to benefit Black and brown people. Let's be clear. For white children and white people, your humanity has been stripped in a way that you got to do a lot of remediation to get that humanity back. Mm-hmm. You cannot operate in this as a perpetuator of this system without being completely detached from your humanity. Mm-hmm. And so until we understand and come to this reckoning that systemic racism hurts white people just as bad than Black and brown people, if we don't come to a conclusion that systemic patriarchy hurts men and boys just as bad as it hurts women and girls, then we're not getting at the heart of this work.
So if my brothers and sisters are being hurt by the system, I cannot be okay.
That's right.
It is part of my responsibility to make sure that we have this collective well-being so we can all move forward and fulfill our greatest potential.
It hasn't happened for 250 years. It's not going to happen with the election of a new president. It's not going to happen with any of the other local changes we might make, even though we need to make those changes. It's only going to happen through all of us committing deeply on a daily basis to make it a point of emphasis in everything we do, in every decision we make, in every action we engage in.
I'm finding what people are grappling with is a strong desire to want to do better or be different, but also paralyzed with fear that they're going to say or do the wrong thing.
We talked about this piece of being scared. Like, I don't know what to do differently. I know I need to do things differently. I don't want to screw it up. It feels really important to me.
Yeah, we don't know. And I said that earlier, that it's important to know that in this changing environment, to be honest and to be vulnerable about not knowing and giving yourself permission to not have all the answers.
I wonder how, when white folks or folks who are on this call and even callers or people who are watching, when you saw the utter annihilation and killing of these important men, Black men, Ahmaud Arbery, Floyd George, what was happening for you? Because I know what was happening for me.
For me, I think if I'm really honest, what happens is I see that and I just push it away because it's too much. It feels like too much. How do I process this? How do I handle this? Let me just keep scrolling. And I don't think that's who I want to be.
I have a tendency, and I think many of us do, to translate emotions into thoughts where we may be more comfortable manipulating them. So we want to intellectualize some of these feelings to bypass the discomfort of the feeling. And what I would suggest is that you give yourself permission to feel fully.
What happens when we detach from emotion? You know, what happens when we can watch somebody being murdered in front of us and we don't feel it?
Yeah.
What I see, like when fear and shame are hidden, I think it can lead to violence, right? So violence of all kinds, physical violence, psychic violence, emotional violence. And those are the emotions that I've seen, certainly white friends, colleagues, others witnessing it on television, where those emotions don't necessarily rise up. I'm afraid. I feel ashamed, right? And if they're hidden, I do think that's where it emerges in violence. But when they can surface, I think that's a space of vulnerability, right? We know Brené Brown and others in this space, vulnerability is at the heart of being human, right? For me, I believe that that's where empathy and compassion can bloom.
For me, I want to work with people who are angry about what's happening, right? Like, I really want to be clear that I don't want people to feel bad. don't, want to, we talked about like, how does it land for someone to say, I didn't know, or I was shocked, like I get it. And at the same time, like, this isn't the place to come to have your privilege pitied, right? Like, or just forgiven right at the onset. But like, I want you to be angry enough that it's of value enough that you would move to action.
So how do we reconnect with this emotional experience of the struggle that we're in?
When I created 6 Seconds, I wanted to change the world. And then the longer I was in the organization and the more I did research about emotional intelligence and what's going on and happening, I discovered that what's really important is I have to change myself.
This work starts with the self, right? In order to oppress people, in order to maintain status quo systems of oppression, it is incumbent upon the oppressor to ensure that the people who are being oppressed are detached from their humanity. If I am not detached from my humanity, I cannot inflict harm on your humanity, because I will see that your humanity is inextricably tied to mine.
This conversation is very confronting and it's very specific. It's Black and it's white. It's forcing us to look at things in a new way that has been around us for a very long time. And it feels really big and really heavy. I think it starts with a conversation. I think it starts with some self-reflection and some self-awareness. And starting with you, we all want to jump to walking in someone else's shoes and what would it feel like? And I can't imagine. And I think some of it is sitting with ourselves and sitting with our fear and working through it.
I have resisted seeing my, like, I mean, I know, like, I know I'm a lot whiter, but I don't, like, that's not my identity. And I realize that's also part of my privilege, is that I don't have to think about my race or my skin color as identity.
The experience of a white man is real. I don't doubt that there's pain. The question that is, how do we all begin to process what ours is and create space for that? I think I've experienced is that my pain is less as a Black man, so let's not pay attention to it. I'll shut mine up. That process destroys us all. And so the goal of having tools is to say, what's really coming up for you?
There has been research that has shown that when you are in the moment, when you are mindful in the moment, it allows you to interrupt some stuff that you might automatically knee jerk and do. So I might automatically knee jerk and call on the boys in my classroom versus the girls. But if I am in the present moment and very aware and being a self-observer, I can interrupt that, right? And so there's a level of being in the present moment. There's a level of self-inquiry. There's a self-inquiry process that needs to happen. And checking in with my feelings. Why do I jump every time I see a Black man or Black boy passing by me? Go through a line of inquiry around that and figure out, when did you get those messages that Black boys and Black men are some people to be feared? Self-inquiry is critical, and doing that in community is important. So you need to do this individual self-inquiry process as well as doing it within communities. There's some things that we cannot see on our own without a community, a fellowship who can help us through that.
For me, what I've been doing to attempt to try to navigate these challenging waters that we're in is to go, well, what do I need to be aware of about the current situation? As a Black man, as a white man, as a woman, as someone who's in the LGBT community. So that awareness is very specific for us all. Then we go to, well, what are my options? So if our listeners are saying, as a white person, I don't know what to do. Well, we need to be aware that we don't know what to do, then begin to brainstorm with a few people what some of the options that we can take to move forward. And so when I think about the racism that we're facing and we're seeing in the cultural clashes, the EQ process, for me specifically, as someone who has seen mirror images of myself killed in the streets and abused for hundreds and hundreds of years, this EQ, or this emotional learning process, gives me some hope, because I can take a simple process and begin to go, what do I need to be aware of? What are some of the options? And then what will I commit to doing?
we have to look at the entire power structure and to look at what it is we need to change. Because we can talk about equity until the cows come home. If the system remains the same, we are always swimming upstream.
And I think when we're talking about these kind of chaotic experiences in America, we need white folks not just to hear, but then to say, what are the systems that I'm supporting, aware or unaware, that I can begin to pull my foot off the lever some.
One way is vote better, right? One way is stepping aside, look in your organizations and say, okay, who's not at this table? Who's not in the boardroom? Who actually has great ideas that I've kind of like pushed them off to the side? Like, the stepping aside is important. The voting better is important. The self-analysis, where does inequity show up in my community? Why aren't there Black people in my community if I live in a homogeneously white community? And then exploring like redlining and the history behind that. So it's investigative work, and it's also like just like vote better.
Right. And I think some of the challenge that we may face is around this notion that power doesn't concede itself. Power has to be generally taken in some way. And so we have all of these notions around that. And so if we're going to shift power and if we're going to have an equitable society, how do we start to talk about how we shift power in a way that is effective and human?
The solutions are usually in the room. And one of the 6 seconds principles is that wisdom lives within. And so as we have the humility to listen to each other and to figure out how do we provide those solutions that are needed, I think it, particularly around race and racism, people of color knowing that you see, it helps me to realize that I'm not just seeing things alone.
Having an opportunity to bridge the gap between groups of people who don't typically talk with each other would be that's the first step. And we can't not do that out of fear. We can't not have conversations because we're afraid of the outcome when the solution might be within those conversations.
Without the expectation that you're going to teach me and my group, how to solve it. The tiredness I've heard from folks of color is that they've been doing that forever. And it's not your responsibility. I think the burden lies within my group, white folks, to really, because in the corporate world, we sit in most of the positions of leadership. And I think it's a dutiful responsibility of any leader, any white person to, as uncomfortable as it may get, sit with that pain and try to understand it without defending, deflecting, or negating or minimizing what that experience is for others.
Centering voices other than your own is something that is really important at this time. And that could look like book reading. It could look like, listening to a panel of folks that look different than you. And I just believe we need to approach those conversations with an expectation that there is going to be truth spoken. I mean, that's the critical thinking is important. But as people share their stories, as people share what is truth for them, I think if we can approach some things with a little more grace, to trust that people are sharing what is real for them, instead of being too quick to discount what we might be hearing.
The system of racism really is dehumanizing not only, to the targeted, it's the perpetrator and the witness bearer. It is the bystander, targeted, and the perpetrator. It is it's the function of it. And I would say what I'm also seeing and needs to, I think, to be more formally named is racism's function as a dehumanizing factor for whiteness, or white folks who are perpetrating white privilege or supremacy. And that there's this minimization where it's less about being human and it's around identity that's connected to whiteness and white supremacy. There's something about that it's minimizing, right?
Dysfunction manifests in thinking that you're more than, as well as thinking that you're less than.
And both of those need to be addressed. We sometimes forget about some of the victims of white supremacy, which are white folks who think they're more than, which is inherently dysfunctional. And if we don't have these conversations that Pamela talked about, if we don't find ourselves being honest with ourselves about where we really are, as you talked about, just the guilt of privilege, Josh, if we don't open ourselves up to manifesting the power through creativity and agency voices that you mentioned, Victor, I think our journey is going to be longer and harder than it could be.
Maybe we don't need to learn anything else. Maybe we just need to unlearn some stuff. And so I think we can get really honed in on reading and intellectualizing racism and never do a dang on thing. And so my challenge would be, what's one thing you would do even from this conversation? What's one thing you'll try to do in light of what you've heard today? Because if we're not going to do nothing, then what's the point of talking?
Mm-hmm.
This reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, James Baldwin. He says, "Because I love you, I have to make you conscious of all the things that you don't see." And that's very much how I feel about this work and about this country and about this world. It's like, because I love you, because I love this country, because I love this world, I needed to do better. And I needed to do better for all the Black and brown babies that are coming after me to make sure that there's a world for them, one, period, and a world that's equitable and just for them to be able to live in.